We're cruising along and closer to our finish line. I do have a schedule speed bump that I have to throw in here, which is just basically that I didn't realize I have just too much on the plate right now for next week. For like basically the first 4 people, I need to kind of reschedule you until later. And probably just either anytime like after starting let's say 1:30. Well, let's say 1. Let's say 1, starting from 1 p.m. So I'm just gonna recirculate this 1 p.m. I can also meet after class, which is 6:30, right? So 6:30, 6:50, and so on, or another day on Zoom. So it's Tim, Sarah, Jen, Dakota. Okay. So can you just, pick of you 4 sometimes, and if there's nothing on that particular frame, like we'll just do another day on Zoom. Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. So basically, just theory-wise, we are in our last units here of new methods, and I think one of the conversations we'll have today too, I don't know where and how we'll sort of frame it, but it's sort of like, does a new method also mean a new identity? If the English department, as we know, we've had this long conversation about it, it's always in search of a method. That's actually, I think, a good thing. It's a strength, but also it's a weakness. It's a pharmacon, just since we're using that word a minute ago. The English department is a pharmacon for university. The English department has its own pharmacon, which is it's constantly reinventing itself. It's constantly discovering new methods. In a way, you have no choice, because if you're just repeating other people's ideas, we don't consider that a legitimate project in the English department. And we, in some sense, have to invent what we do each time. But that's that's a lot to ask for. It's a lot of burden on the shoulders to have to reinvent yourself over and over again. But hey, Bob Dylan can do it. and same thing, Kanye West. That's your reference. I don't know. So I'll just even say out loud. I think some of you maybe I think this was last year where I did this panel on the book that I had written, which is called "What Is Extinction?" And I just said I felt like I had to invent how I'd write this book. Although I would have said that on my first book too. Probably everything I write, I kind of have to invent what I'm doing. But for sure, this recent book is it was quite interdisciplinary. It was very conceptual driven. But I used psychoanalysis. I used literary theory tools like formalism. I used ecology and animal studies and all the above. But and while I think other scholars kind of do similar things, but I would say we're all sort of inventing how we're going to make that combination make sense. And that's, I think, a good thing, because I was happy with what I came up with, but it's also a challenge if you have to, yes, we always have precursors, and yes, we have models that influence us, and so on. But the question of how you take up that challenge to reinvent your method it's a difficult one, to say the least. So anyways, we are also adding the complication that we might suggest that there's an overlap between the need to invent methods and also what an identity is, what a changing identity is, what sort of the creative, or also I want to say theory creative side of what identity means, and so on. And more specifically, even a certain, we would say, racial terminology embedded in all the above. So we're just going to jump in with Frantz Fanon to start with. He is superstar at this point. Sadly, way too short of a lifespan. Would have been just amazing to see what he had done with it if he had more time. And his work he's a trained psychotherapist and sort of has a medical background, but also is clearly embedded in an explosion of French theory, and he's from Martinique. So I'm just gonna, I'm pretty sure he's from Martinique, right? Born in Martinique? Yeah. Which is a French colony, which still is a French colony. And he has sort of, an outsider's view of the of the explosion of French theory. And so he's reading people like Sartre and Lacan, and wondering where does he fit in this whole spectrum? How could he read, existentialism and psychoanalysis and not find himself there, not find himself theorized there? And that's this explosion of critical race theory in that encounter. So, without further ado, let's see. I think, we can just read our opening pages on 1353. And I think we'll just actually start this first paragraph. I'll just read it here. It says, 1353. And then the occasion arose. This is obviously a much shorter excerpt of the book. And then the occasion arose when I had to meet the white man's eyes. An unfamiliar weight burdened me. The real world challenged my claims. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulty in the development of his bodily schema. Consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousess. I'm going to actually already pause there because I think there's enough going on that we can start to unpack. So, in this first paragraph, what is he? He's comparing the white world and the white sort of language around consciousness, body, and say gaze to what he experiences. And what is his version of that? I'm going to already ask you as a question. What is he saying here about his encounter with those very terms? The set of key terms already. So mine.
I think this is him talking about his position in a society that's not black society, and encountering somebody of a different race, and how I think there's automatically an assumption which is completely implicit that there's some labor that he has to perform within that society to actually be recognized. In a place that's not entirely homogeneously black. Okay, good. So he's already saying, okay, you have these terms like the gaze, let's say, or the bodily schema, or consciousness, or bodies as such. Fine, I'll pick those terms up because that's what we do in theory, and I will use them. Oh wait, now I'm using them and they don't actually fit, or they feel different when he, as a black man, uses them, and we're already picking that up, and he's starting to show us the difference that he experiences with these terms. Okay, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in or not. Okay, well, Sarah, go ahead.
There's also he says that it's a negating experience, right? So it's not just that it's an expectation to be seen. It's that in the recognition that people usually find through looking at others and the comparison of self to the other, all of that, that's not present for him. The experience of consciousness for him is that is functionally he doesn't exist, or that he's kind of not real or can't be reflected. Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right. So you've both picked up on the thing that I wanted to get to as we're starting with this this early section, which is the following, which is okay. So you can imagine Fanon reading Sartre, reading Lacan, reading Hegel, reading Kant or whoever it is, and there's Merleau-Ponty is in there, if you know who that is, and then sort of reading theory,
and seeing that these terms circulate in a very white way, we might say, or unmarked racial way, and suddenly there's a whole huge gap in theory. And so let's just reiterate, we talked about the sign, and how the sign at first in someone like Saussure is very neutral and sort of decontextualized and almost mechanical and functional and structural and ahistorical, and we criticize it for all these problems. On the one hand, it was brilliant. He theorized the sort of semiotic unit in a very clever way. But on the other hand, we're well, why is there no gendered speaker of this? Why now we're going to talk about a sort of more racial speaker? Why is there no historical speaker? And also, let's say, a period. The ways people speak and what signs matter in certain periods are meaningful, and so on. Why also the psychoanalytic effect of the sign, all the sort of the questions of desire and let's say uncanny effects of the sign. They were all not there because if you're being too scientific and structural and acontextual, you lose all that. So we're putting all that back in the sign. And Fanon is going to do that with issues of race. And say that, okay, it was good that you did psychoanalysis. It was good that you did all this, even feminism. Simone de Beauvoir is in this as well. But that wasn't enough. The sign does change, or the experience of consciousness, let's say consciousness, that's what he's talking about here, changes when you particularize it through, let's say, a black male body. And so, what happens when you do that particularizing? Well, the first thing that seems to happen over and over again is that everything seems negated, or experienced as negative, or experienced as unavailable. That's sort of what we mean by negation, as either blocked or missing or lacking. These are all sort of synonyms to some degree. So he says consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It's a third-person consciousness. He can't say the word I. He can't say first-person consciousness. So that if you read your Hegel or your Sartre, that's constantly what consciousness is trying to achieve. This sort of unity of the individual and the social, we'd say, and achieving through the sort of the thinker, the I that thinks. And this keep getting stopped or negated by in the sort of black mind or black consciousness, because there is no way to unify it. The black body and let's say the white standard of what bodies are. But even that word negating, it's a very Sartrean Hegelian word, and it's never racialized in their terms. Hegel maybe with his master-slave dialectic, but you can translate that as not necessarily master and slave. That's a very racial terminology, but if you translate it as lord and bondsman, it's more feudalistic language. And so it depends historically how you want to do that, but everyone's convinced now that it was a reference to to slavery at the time, which was widespread. That book is from 1806, 1807. So it historically is situated right in the midst of slavery. But Hegel doesn't really do that work. And Hegel, by the way, there's lots of scholars who love to talk about this, theorists love to talk about this. Hegel has a lot of racist language about Africa, which is sort of this thing that is way in history. It's well been surpassed. It has no historical purpose anymore. There's no such thing as self-consciousness for Africa, right? Because it's just a remnant that is history is sort of marched on by and so on. So so that's negated, But and so this thing that comes over and over again is the negative is a racial term, and it has been attached to sort of blackness for a very long time, and yet never been theorized until basically Fanon is doing this kind of work. It still is a very contemporary term. There's a field of scholarship as we speak called Afro-pessimism, and it's a set of theorists which sometimes include Fred Moten, but others I'm blanking on. Well, David Marriott is someone actually I'm hoping to bring to the Theory Center in a couple of months, but
Frank Wilder.
Yeah, Frank Wilder. Thank you. Yeah, Frank Wilder would be one of the. He has a book called, I think, Afro-pessimism, and it's just an expanded argument based on some of this language saying that blackness and negativity are stuck with each other, metaphysically, like forever, basically. It's not just a historical, like, they're ontologically or metaphysically, I hope that's not too grandiose of language, but that's the argument they're making, is like, you cannot disassociate blackness and negativity, and that's why they call it Afro-pessimism. So, because any option for blackness seems to always be stuck with this negative problem. Okay, but Fanon is just trying to figure these terms out and recognize that they have a racial history, but it is a major breakthrough in theory to show that all the terms that were thought to be, let's say, universal, were actually racially marked. Okay, so this section, by the way, is it's from the Fact of Blackness. I should have brought my Fanon book, but oh well. I think actually yeah, okay, yeah, here it is. Translate, yeah. It says here on the bottom, l'expérience vécue du noir. It's not supposed to be translated as the fact of. It's a bad translation. Expérience vécue is translated as lived experience. A phrase that still circulates today when we talked about lived experience. So that comes out of Fanon, but it actually comes out of existentialism in Sartre. And so you see in Sartre and in Simone de Beauvoir, they're theorizing the lived experience. And then Simone de Beauvoir says, oh, there's a lived experience of woman. It's different than the lived experience of man. And Fanon's like saying, yeah, and then the lived experience of blackness is different than the lived experience of whiteness. So he's going to develop that throughout the rest of this chapter. Okay. The next section is sort of showing out some stereotypes. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, just that specifically. But what's interesting is that by the bottom of that, into the next page, he starts listing counter examples of stereotypes. And in like anthropology and others, and he says, so he lists a bunch of anthropologists that are not that important, but these are actually all white anthropologists, or some of them, I think. Actually, yeah, I think they're all white. But had started to recognize that there was sort of way more complex black history. And this is something that Fanon is picking up on, and he says the following. Okay, so then he lists these cities, Seju and Jenne. Let me get a footnote there, which is an ancient center for Islamic scholarship in Mali. And Seju is also in Mali. Cities of more than 100,000 people, and these are all like cities of 1 or 2,000 years old cities. Accounts of learned blacks, doctors of theology went to Mecca to interpret the Quran. All of that exhumed from the past, spread with its inside out, made it possible for me to find a valid historical place. The white man was wrong. I was not a primitive, not even a half man. I belonged to a race that had already been working in gold and silver 2,000 years ago. Then there's a longer quote from Césaire, who's a Martinican poet and and theorist as well. And here's what Césaire says: "What sort of men were these then, who had been torn away from their families, their countries, their religions, with a savagery unparalleled in history? Gentlemen, polite, considerate, unconsciously superior to those who tortured them." So when he listed a bunch of negative stereotypes, blackness associated with negativity, here is Fanon saying, wait a second, that's if you just cherry pick basically the evidence, because if you actually look at the history of Africa, you see the opposite. You see considerate, smart, deeply knowledgeable, diverse communities and peoples and individuals. So this is the men they took away knew how to build houses, govern empires, erect cities, cultivate fields, mine for metals, weave cotton, forge steel. So they had all of let's say complexity and civilization, if that's the right word. The religion had its own beauty. There's also a lot of sort of, I would say, decolonial language here, or what we would call even like sort of resonance with indigenous theory, as we'll see next week. Their customs were pleasing, no coercion, only mutual assistance, the joy of living, a free acceptance of discipline, order, earnestness, poetry, and freedom. So this is a very radically positive set of terms that can be counter to all this stereotyping language. I just point that out because it's great to see this as a counterpoint and as a quote. I personally, for example, I'm working on a edited volume on a poet named Will Alexander. And he is a contemporary African-American poet and lives in Los Angeles. He's older, he's like 76 or so years old. And one of the reasons I love his poetry is that he is so aware of all these details, especially in Africa, of let's say, the history of poetic thinking and discovery, and I would say like a kind of avant-garde, if that's the right word, of 2,000 years that sort of shows up here and there in his contemporary poetry. And he is very positive about all this. He's like he is not an Afro-pessimist. He's the very opposite. But he's sort of an Afro-optimist, I would say. And that you want high theory, you want complex poetry, you want a whole set of, let's say, ethical and conceptual tools. It's there. It's already there. It doesn't have to be, even Fanon doesn't even have to invent it. He's just showing how it was already there all along time, but then destroyed through colonialism. All right, anyways, that was me spinning through some of this details here. Let's zoom in on at least a tiny bit more of a couple of other things going on in this selection. There is a long argument with Sartre, and it is an interesting one, so I thought we might see a few of the elements. So as we go on some of the paragraphs here, I'll point out that, by the way, that the degree that he shows how there's a huge amount of poetry and art and science and knowledge in African culture and history, that suggests that whiteness, the phrase we might use is provincialized, shown to be not the origin and center of all this, but shown to be one among other sites for we would call all of the above. Okay, but anyways, he's going on to Sartre, and Sartre has an interesting take on this. He sort of has a back and forth with people like Fanon and Aimé Césaire. And you'll see the word negritude, and there is a footnote to that, but if you haven't encountered that term before, it refers to basically 1930s, 1940s, in Martinique, in France, and then we'll spread to North Africa and rest. It's sort of like this first. It's like an avant-garde black set of writers who saw, they were influenced by surrealism, and surrealism was manifestos and sort of their own avant-garde gesture. And they're like, well, we want to do that, but we want to pick up some of that tradition, including surrealism, but we want to do it for the black community and for the sort of colonized. And they called their movement negritude. And it only sort of coalesced for a few years, we would say, but Césaire lived for a very long time, and into 2000, and so did Senghor. And Senghor ended up, as it says, the first elected president of Senegal. So these persons end up becoming very important politically as well as artistically. And negritude was this first coalescing of this argument that they were making. Okay, so here's the following. On 1355 in the middle there. It says, my unreason was countered with reason. Well, actually, I'll go slightly before that. All right, so Fanon says the following. All right, I put the white man in his place. Growing bolder, I jostled him and told him point blank, get used to me, I'm not getting used to anyone. I shouted my laughter to the stars. The white man I could see was resentful. His reaction time lagged interminably. I had won. I was jubilant. So this is him sort of playing out the argument in his mind. Like, look, black tradition is full of all this art and science. And then here's the response, he imagines. Lay aside your history, your investigations of the past, and try to feel yourself into our rhythm. In a society such as ours, industrial is to the highest degree dominated by scientism. There's no longer room for your sensitivity. One must be tough if one's allowed to live. What matters now is no longer playing the game of the world, but subjugating it with integers, like math, basically, and atoms, so science, in other words. There's a little bit more of this paragraph, but it's not that important, the details. So the idea that there's sort of something else, another reason why Fanon feels belittled. And it continues into the next paragraph. Thus my unreason was countered with reason, a different kind of reason, right? Another negation of what he's saying. With real reason, every hand was a losing hand for me. I analyzed my heredity. I made a complete audit of my ailment. I wanted to be typically Negro. It was no longer possible. I wanted to be white. That was a joke. And when I tried on the levels of ideas and intellectual activity to reclaim my negritude, it was snatched away from me. Proof was presented that my effort was only a term in the dialectic. And then we get this long quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. It says, but there is something more important. The Negro, as we have said, creates an anti-racist racism for himself. So this is Sartre essentially saying negritude is a form of racism. It's a little bit questionable, to say the least. In no sense does he wish to rule the world. He seeks the abolition of all ethnic privileges, wherever they come from. He asserts his solidarity with the oppressed of all colors. At once subjective, existential, ethnic idea of negritude passes, as Hegel puts it, into the objective, positive, exact idea of the proletariat. Skipping a little bit, this quote from Senghor on Césaire. He says, down at the bottom there, but this does not prevent the idea of race from mingling with that of class. The first is concrete and particular, the second is universal and abstract. The one stems from what Jaspers call understanding, and the other from election. Right? Skipping a little bit. In fact, negritude appears as the minor term of a dialectical progression. The theoretical and practical assertion of the supremacy of the white man is its thesis. The position of negritude is antithetical. That is an antithetical value in the moment of its negativity. But the negative moment is insufficient by itself, and Negroes who employ it must do this very well. They know that it is intended to prepare the synthesis or realization of the human in a society without races. Thus, negritude is the root of its own destruction. It's transition, not a conclusion, and it means not an ultimate end. And then here's the response. When I read that page, I felt I had been robbed of my last change. I said to my friends, the generation of the younger black poets has just suffered a blow that can never be forgiven. All right, and just skipping a little bit. In opposition to rationalism, Sartre summed up the negative side, but he forgot that this negative draws its worth from an almost substantive absoluteness. A consciousness committed to experience is ignorant. It has to be ignorant of the essences and the determinations of its being. Okay, that's good enough. I'm going to ask you, let's just sum up this debate here. What's Sartre saying about Fanon and Césaire and Senghor? What is Sartre saying about this movement, and what is Fanon saying in response? This is some complex theory debate here. This is good to have us walk it through just for a minute. What is Sartre, first of all, saying about how does he read what Fanon is doing? Go ahead.
Basically, if negritude and other kind of black art, black theory, black culture movements are kind of highlighting this presence of blackness in the face of white supremacy.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal will not be that those things coexist.
Yeah.
But that race is abolished, and therefore the work of creating a uniquely black culture is ultimately its own undermines itself. Yeah. In the move towards the abolition of race.
Yeah, exactly. So he would say that the march of history, almost like a Hegelian style, whatever, is towards we're all together, and that means racial particularisms will have to disappear in this big picture of humanity as such, right? Then he also there's this proletarian argument. Does anybody want to specify that for a second? Sartre is a Marxist. What is he saying about the sort of political politics of this movement? Yeah.
He's trying to make that a meta-narrative. He's saying that is actually the bigger picture, that is the bigger problem. This is only a smaller part that could somehow be embedded within that one.
Exactly. So he's saying race is a problem, but the bigger problem is class. And so racial, let's say, injustices are important, but they are part of the bigger picture, which is the biggest injustice is class injustice and class stratification and exploitation and so on. And to solve the picture, you'd have to solve, let's say, that class injustice. And then somehow racial injustice will just sort of disappear, because we'll all be human. And by the way, you hear this language today, just in this election in the United States. It was sort of what was the real grievance? Was it racial? Was it like race differences and race injustices as the sort of primary question for voters, or was it class? And a lot of people are just saying, no, this one was definitely about class. Like race sort of was a secondary thing. And you can make the case because Trump had a kind of multiracial voting coalition that he managed to convince. But Fanon has something to say about that. So what is Fanon's response to Sartre? What does he think about this theory, this sort of theory of history and theory of the proletariat? What is Fanon saying in response? And I can read a few other things just to maybe get some language here, but at the bottom of this 1356, he says, and so it was not I who made meaning for myself, but it is the meaning that was already there, pre-existing, waiting for me. Let's see, a little bit further. In terms of consciousness, the black consciousness is held out as an absolute density, is filled with itself, a stage preceding any invasion, any abolition of the ego by desire. It's a bit technical language there, but Jean-Paul Sartre in his work has destroyed black zeal. And then it kind of vocalizes it, like, you'll change, my boy. I always liked that too when I was young. You'll see it would all pass. The dialectic that brings necessity in the foundation of my freedom drives me out of myself. It shatters my unreflected position. Still in terms of consciousness, black consciousness is immanent in its own eyes. I am not a potentiality of something. I am wholly what I am. I do not have to look for the universal. No probability is a place inside me. My Negro consciousness does not hold itself out as lack. It is. It is its own follower. Okay, so pretty impressive response there, but paraphrase it for me. What is Fanon saying in response? So go ahead, Neil.
I feel like what he's trying to say is that following that meta-narrative would negate his being.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't contain it. It is a different kind of ontology, if we can call it. And there's another part where he says, in answer to Sartre, he says that I don't want to carry this flag. This is not my flag. I don't identify with this. I want to carry my own flag.
Yeah. I mean, we might ask, or even he might be willing to carry a universal flag, but not certainly at the cost of carrying his own flag, if we use that metaphor. Can you carry two flags at once? A universal in particular. This is sort of these famous philosophical, even Hegelian Sartrean points, but Fanon is saying that I'm not going to drop the flag of my blackness to carry your flag, that's for sure. Just only. And if one does, you'd just be redoing that same thing that blackness is negation. It's to be negated, one way or another. Okay, so Tim, what else?
Yeah, he is also sort of talking about there's a structure that we're born into, and part of that structure is like baked into it is an oppression to black people. Like it's part of it, and if part of the project of Sartre and people like Fanon is to become aware of these structures that structure our consciousness, to become aware of them, to become aware of our ability to act within them, ignoring what is so blatantly baked into it that is there, just overlooking it for something larger is missing the point. You're actually not going to be able to fully understand the structure. Yeah,
well said, exactly, yeah. So even, or to pretend that these structures somehow dissolve when you look at the bigger structures is to miss how these actually work as structures. And so he's absolutely articulating that. There's one thing I'll add in a second, but maybe you'll...
Well, I think there's also, he talks about, the fact that his, project of creating a consciousness, of discovering, a consciousness of the self is being, reduced to a historical inevitability. Yeah. Right? It's undermining the ability for people to define themselves. Yeah. I've been reading Scott Richard Vine's Rhetorical Sovereignty. Okay. Right? Which is kind of about the ability to define the terms of the conversation. Yeah. That for Lyons it's about decolonization. Okay. But that kind of seems like what's happening here, right? They're defining the black consciousness, and you're reducing the work of defining the black consciousness. Yeah, as a stage in history, or as
that
had to have
temporary,
come, and then has to pass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's worth saying that very few of us anymore have like a theory of history. Like you don't live. Do you live with a theory of history that guides you as such? And yet, as we know in this class, having no theory of history is a theory of history. So you are guided by something, I'm sure. But it used to be, I think, more common that one did have that. Maybe that theory was religion. Maybe it was Marxism, for the very few who have thought of that. But maybe it was, like Kant is like, has this theory of cosmopolitanism. He says basically like history is trending to this sort of like global collectivity. It's very, essentially a form of universalism that Hegel picks up in his heart. So is history trending to the universal, the cosmopolitan, the collective? Is history trendless? Is history empty? No trend for you. I actually think it's still a very valid question for all of us. I mean, is history just everyday capitalism? And it doesn't, and now it just has no direction. Directionless capitalism. Is it ecology for you? Is it some form of radical self-discovery for you, or something like that? Well, whatever it is, I think we should have histories. I think we should think about that. But Fanon is careful to say, like, I'm not going to pick your version of it, Sartre. Whether that's the rise of the proletariat, or the rise of Marxism, or the rise of Hegelian universal, or a sort of self-consciousness that history is going to play out on its own, whether I do anything or not. A lot of times, all these philosophies of history sort of just are kind of inevitabilized, or said to be sort of necessary and deterministic, and like what any particular person does is not that relevant. And so he's refusing all that, or also saying that all those versions of history are racially problematic. And then finally, he's going to use the language of affirmation rather than negation. And he says, still in terms of consciousness, black consciousness is immanent in its own eyes. Immanent is again a philosophical term you find in Hegel, but it's like you possess it on your own. You don't have to seek it in an outside of you. Immanent means internal. It's internal to my point of view. It's not that I have to leave myself to find who I am. Then he says, it's not a potentiality of something. It's not elsewhere. He says, it's already what I am. It's in my very being. I do not have to look for it in the universal. So it's not some like bigger category that he has to locate it in. Then he says, my bigger consciousness will not hold itself out as lack. So that is a key word for Lacan. So that's definitely a slap at Lacan. Lacan actually does find it in Sartre. So he's rejecting both. But Lacanian psychoanalysis, by the way, is this theory of lack. He says desire is lack. Why? Because the mirror stage already showed you don't possess yourself fully. The mirror stage is a theory of lack. There's something missing in who you are, and that's how you get a self. Okay, you never have a full sense of your own self. You have to project it elsewhere, onto others, or see others. And so it was a theory of desire. So whether you looked for yourself in others, or whether you looked at others to find who yourself is or are, you have to sort of desire and lack are sort of essentially the same thing. But he's saying, no, that's not the theory that I want to describe myself and my desire. It is its own follower. It sort of makes its situation. Okay, that's probably a pretty extended take on some of this high theory going on here. But now there's a few other things going on. He says suddenly he goes, "I will be told your statements show a misreading of the process of history. Listen then," and he quotes a poet named Jacques Roumain, and it's an interesting poem here, and I'll just a few lines. Africa, I've kept your memory of Africa, you are inside me, and yet I want to be of your race alone. And destiny ranges us shoulder to shoulder. Sort of, the white worker, the black peon, the peasant in Alabama, and so on. This kind of proletarian universalism kind of shows up in this poem. But next page, exactly we will reply. Negro experience is not a whole, for there is not merely one Negro, there are multiple, plural. What a difference, for example, in this other poem. And this is a poem from David Diop. And I won't read the poem, but it's sort of interesting how suddenly a series of poems are being cited here. And another poem from David Diop, and then the next poem is from Aimé Césaire, and then a little later we get a play from Sartre, And all of this is sort of evidence of I'll say on like 1359. It's not true that I can tell you, as my shoulders slipped out of the framework of the world, my feet could no longer feel the touch of the ground. Without a Negro past, without a Negro future, it was impossible for me to live my Negrohood. Not yet white, no longer wholly black, I was damned. So this is sort of him kind of thinking through where he feels stuck in sort of this world of people like Sartre and so on. But next paragraph he says, the constancy of my love had been forgotten. I defined myself as an absolute intensity of beginning. So I took up my negritude and with tears in my eyes, I put its machinery together again. What had been broken to pieces was rebuilt, reconstructed in the intuitive lianas of my hands. Lianas is like vines. Okay, now that we've read that, I want to ask you, why is he quoting so much poetry here? Seems like something we do, and we think it's pretty normal, but in reality, it's pretty weird. So the bigger question I have about this is we need to talk about the same way we talked about style in someone like Virginia Woolf and many others, essentially every theorist we've talked about style. Well, Fanon, I'm interested in what you think is going on here with what we would call style, method, or citation. So what is going on, do you think? Why all this poetry suddenly? Alongside of what else have you seen? We've seen philosophy, saw anthropology and history. So what's going on now?
So I feel like it's his way of theorizing. He's trying to use a language that is specific for the Negro. So he doesn't want to use the language that Sartre is using.
Yeah.
So he's
We'll just say black, by the way. It's an older translation. Yeah.
But he says it.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a dated translation, but yeah, we'll say black.
So sorry about that. So what he was trying to argue against that meta-narrative is that the language of that meta-narrative is not fit for my existence, so I need to have a language of my own.
Exactly.
And this is why he's using poetry, because his poetry is what he finds relevant to his own identity and his own existence. And that's how he wants to express it.
But not just the poetry, I would say, but yes, absolutely. So the poetry is going to be cited and used as evidence for this emerging self-consciousness of what it means to be black. And of course, we'd say sort of like black and poetic, or black and surrealist, or metaphorical, or I don't know, use whatever terminologies you want to use, lyrical, and so on. So far, so good. What else about style or method is going on in here? Yeah.
Just sort of two ideas. One is that he's really inserting himself into this work a lot. Like he uses I very forcefully and intentionally, which I think goes to the point of reflecting on one's own consciousness. And just really trying to examine the ways in which consciousness is structured.
Yeah.
The other thing too, I think about the poetry and stuff is that I believe it's in Wretched of the Earth that Fanon talks about like how to build a nation, like how out of colonialism, what do you do?
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really important for Fanon is like language and specifically literature.
Yeah, poetry.
Because language in one way connects you to the past, but it also connects you to the present with like in words and like in experiences. So like, people who share experiences will share words and certain phrases that recount something that can't be recounted in another language.
Yeah, well, nicely said. So it's not just an argument for poetry as let's say in the past, or constructing like an already built, let's say, black identity, but it has we can theorize the poetics of citing poetry as gesture for the future. As creative self-making, creative future-making, demonstrating the imagination, not just calling forth it, but putting it out there. Building also what you said on Tim, you said there's a lot of first-person I, and that is really, it's brilliant because it's, first of all, he's theorizing consciousness. So in Hegel's term, Hegel will call this self-consciousness. It's the I that theorizes itself, that comes to know itself. He's like, okay, I'll do that. I have an I. Of course, my I is black, and I have to have an understanding of my blackness to have that self-consciousness achievement. So he will use the first person, but also he shows every time he uses it, he also gets caught up in all this negativity, or shame, or lack, or stereotypes, and so on. So it's a very, and also like we would just call it like sort of the emotional spectrum when you use the first person. You have a lot of emotional weight attached to that. Less so sometimes when you use the third person. But he's okay with that. He wants to show all these emotions, all these ups and downs. Just like, I think the longest time we had this conversation was, again, with Virginia Woolf. And we showed that a feminist methodology included imagination, where she, and like inventing Shakespeare's sister as a character. It included anecdote, and let's say personal language. It included the first person, and including her interrupting your own style with another style, or sort of showing her style on the page. You see this exact same thing. Fanon's doing the exact same thing, almost as if he read word for word. He has probably never heard of Virginia Woolf, and that particular text. So, but he's come up with even the ellipses, even the interrupting voices, even the voices in quotes. You'll change, my boy, 1357. Like that other voice, that censor in his head who's saying this, and he's quoting it as if it's that person's present. And it's exactly what we said with, again, Woolf, which is that he's performing the argument. He's not just stating the argument, he's performing it, which is brilliant sort of doubling of one's own theory work, if you will. It's not just stating the theoretical terms, it's performing them in the style. Okay, well, let's see. Any other, yeah, I mean, that's basically what I wanted to say about method here. That one can mix all these together, all these disparate sort of sub-methods, like poetry, theory, philosophy, history, there's anthropology in there. Auto theory, we can call it as well, is in there. That wasn't called that at the time. Personal anecdote. There's like ads show up. He talks about ads and how there's all this racism and like ads for this product called Banania, which still exists. It's sort of like chocolate milk, I think. Surrealism. These are all mixed together, and there's a citational politics, or if you want to call it stylistic politics to this, that fits the argument and is powerful as a sort of collective, like collectivizing. It collectivizes. Collectivizes style and perspective, and method, and voices, and it's sort of like saying, oh, sorry, you want universalism? Well, I'll show you it. And at the level of style, this is what it really looks like. Not the monologic style of Sartre, but the plural style of Fanon and these other voices. And yes, we'll come together and we'll show you how we can collectivize, but it'll be through black consciousness. It won't be through the erasure of that. And it'll be through the affirmation. And it's incredible theory. It's just brilliant. So anyways, it finally just concludes this section with interesting affirmative voice. It says at 1360, nevertheless, with all my strength, I refuse to accept that amputation. I feel myself, the soul as immense as the world. Truly, the soul as deep as the deepest of rivers. My chest has the power to expand without limits. I am a master, and I am advised to adopt the humility of the cripple. This is sort of weird disability language here, but yesterday, awakening to the world, I saw the sky turn upon itself utterly and wholly. I wanted to rise, but the disemboweled silence fell upon me. He's always kind of still struggling. Even though he says, I'm going to rise above all this stuff, he's constantly aware that it's not easy, and it's very difficult for him. Anyways, the silence fell back upon me, his wings paralyzed. Without responsibility, straddling nothingness and infinity, I began to weep. So even though he's affirming himself in some of that language, he's also showing how difficult it is and how sort of melancholic this experience is overall. Okay, that's Fanon. He really is an incredible theorist who unfortunately only really has produced 2 major works and then died very young. Okay, but his work echoes on through the rest of the readings, And now we can turn to Paul Gilroy and Black Atlantic. This is a text from 1993, and I remember when it came out. In terms of the conversations that it broke open, and we have to put ourselves a little bit in the context of that situation. So postmodernism was everywhere. Everybody was reading Frederick Jameson. Everybody was reading Derrida. Everybody was reading Lacan. You had these three towering figures that were the sort of highest of high theory. And Gilroy comes along and says, wait a second. I mean, he's not the only one. I mean, Stuart Hall is doing it as well, as we've seen, and others. But are saying, like, you want to read modernity or postmodernity? These are not non-racial terms, or there was racial issues all along. And blackness is a question of modernity. It's not a sub-question. It's in modernity all along. It's interesting that he quotes Nietzsche to start with. Question of homelessness, and in this book, even the early quote is there's a Nietzsche quote, there's a Benjamin and Nietzsche quote and a Frederick Douglass quote, and essentially saying, look, Benjamin Nietzsche and Frederick Douglass, they are three theorists of modernity. Two of them everyone agrees with. Third one is not obviously often considered a major theorist of modernity, but guess what? He is just as relevant. Now the argument is obvious. Everyone agrees with that. In the 90s, this was radical. This just changed everything. This changed the story of the English department to say that. And I'm so glad he says it, and he's absolutely right. I love reading and thinking about Frederick Douglass. And another person he's going to put back on the map to some degree is W.B. Du Bois. So we agree that again, everyone's reading these high theorists, but not Du Bois or Douglass. This one text does so much work to change a lot of that. And to put those readings back front and center into modernity. And with that, here we go. On 2391, the Black Atlantic, modernity as double consciousness. So, skipping these quotes here, it says the following, 2391. Striving to be both European and black requires some specific forms of double consciousness. By saying this, I do not mean to suggest that taking on either or both of these unfinished identities necessarily exhausts the subjective resources of any particular individual. However, where racist, nationalist, or ethnically absolutist discourses orchestrate political relationships so that these identities appear mutually exclusive, occupying the space between them, or trying to demonstrate that continuity has been viewed as a provocative and even oppositional act of political insubordination. Let's see. Okay, I'll just reread that first sentence. Striving to be both European and black requires some specific forms of double consciousness. And with that, I want to point us to the famous articulation of that in W.E.B. Du Bois' work. I don't know if you've read Du Bois before. Mm-hmm. Fascinating American intellectual, writer of multiple genres. Essays, sociology, fiction, philosophy, and so on. And really his first major work, well, I guess you could call it second, it's called The Souls of Black Folk. And it is a multi-genre piece. So just like we talked about Fanon and Virginia Woolf and many others who are multi-generic in their way they theorize, well, Du Bois is doing the same thing. And I don't think Fanon had read Du Bois either. They just don't think it's circulated that well in the 1950s and 60s. Maybe he did, I don't know. He'd certainly heard of him, but did he actually read him? I don't know. Well, we get to read him. He's in our anthology, and we're going to turn to page 845. And I didn't put it on the syllabus because I should have probably, but I recognize that at least I knew that there was a reference here that so we would at least read a little bit of it together. It's on 845. So I'll read Between Me and the Other World. This is Du Bois. This is 1903-ish, around that. And again, in the context of the United States. And this is after Civil War, after also Reconstruction, which sort of starting to fade by this point, and we have a kind of rise of the Ku Klux Klan and all this stuff. Okay. Between me and the other world, there is an ever unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All that nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eyeing me curiously or compassionately, and instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? Famous quote, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought in Mechanicsville, which is a Civil War. Or do not the southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. And yet, being a problem is a strange experience. And then I'm going to skip to the next page, 846, skipping a little bit to the middle paragraph. All right, maybe a few sentences before he says, why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? It's a quote from Exodus. Shade of the prison house closed round about us all. So on. Okay. Next paragraph. After the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness. Guess who else has been reading Hegel? Du Bois. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, and measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, whenever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two boring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better, truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood is a message for the world, simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, and so on. Okay, and this is where Paul Gilroy kind of begins. My question for you is, let's just pause and say, what is double consciousness? What does double consciousness mean? Be it in Du Bois or be it in this opening paragraph from Paul Gilroy. But what is that? What is double consciousness? Let's theorize that. Kelly, get started.
I guess if single consciousness is like the mirror stage, when you like recognize yourself as like whole, or like reflection of the other, double consciousness is kind of like a second mirror stage, where it's like first you know that you have a self, but then you have to imagine what your self is in relation to like a white person, if you're like in a white majority area, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just gonna put this word up here for a second. Yeah, this is good. These are obviously complex terms, and you're doing well. If you want to just go back to Hegel, Hegel says like there's sense, like we just got the sensation, and that needs to be reflected on by consciousness. Like oh, that was me having that sensation. Okay, and then if I do that, I get self-consciousness. So, or there was sensation, like we might say, sound, like it's got a semiotic thing, like concept. Oh yeah, this is like true idea, full idea, self-consciousness. For someone like Lacan, he would actually already say, wait a second, the mirror stage is actually it is actually double. It's a form of double consciousness, because we don't get this without sort of losing ourselves. Like Hegel also says the self, and then you go sort of kind of a passage of otherness, and then you realize, oh, all along, I was connected to these others. So I guess you would call this community.
or universality or something like that. Well, here, you'd have to start with a particular, you negate it into, well, let's say into the universal, and then you get a true universality, which we might call the absolute, is the unity of the particular and universal. Technically, that's a contradiction, but in the true scheme of all reality, the absolute reality, you realize it's not a contradiction, that the universe is structured that way. And all these sort of get unified. But hey, sorry, Lacan, just pausing there, was sort of like, wait a second, you actually don't get this. You never get your absolute self or full self consciousness, because you're always kind of going between self and other, back and forth, even in yourself. Even the self, before you even encounter another, is split. But it is a double. But you're right. There's a second double consciousness that that Du Bois and Gilroy are pointing to, which is this, as if having two selves in one self, a black self and a white self, or a European and a sort of African, or an American and an African. Okay. All right. Keep going though. Anything else about the self, the double consciousness? Yeah. Does double consciousness go away even in Boyce's model? In the little bit we read, or you can pick that up, or other thoughts, Tina?
For me, actually, double consciousness, I didn't think of it as an identity. I thought of it as a threshold.
Okay.
Between two doors,
Yeah.
the doors are open, so you have like views of the two doors.
Yeah.
But you cannot decide where to go. Like
Yeah.
you are pulling from these two sides. That doesn't go away. Like you cannot stop looking at these two
Yeah.
doors. So
Yeah. What if you, in your metaphor though? What if you pick a door? Can you pick both doors at once? No.
No.
But does that mean one can't have double consciousness simultaneously? One has to pick one conscious or the other? That would be the challenge.
The situation is simultaneous. Like you have the view of the two doors.
You have a view.
Even if you enter into one of the doors, still the door is open and you can see the other
Yeah.
one.
Okay.
But I mean, like we are always in. I mean, these people, like black people especially, they feel kind of being in a state like at that threshold.
Yeah.
They cannot go either way.
Yeah.
And that's why they have this struggle with themselves. That's why they
Yeah.
they made it as a positive point and say that hybridity is what
Yeah, exactly. It leads to this whole, critical race theory, postcolonial theory, in which we're going to valorize the doubleness, or the hybridizing, or the creolization of these. But in the staging in Du Bois, and then as Gilroy picks it up, it's not. This is the experience of modernity as such, and it is a racial experience in their arguments, but it's true that we can extend it beyond that. Gilroy would actually make that argument, but anyways, sticking with what they're saying. So I think we've understood, that the problem of can they be fused? Should they be fused? Should they be kept separate? How do you have is double consciousness a broken consciousness that needs to be sort of fixed, or is it actually the more reflective consciousness that can see, let's say, more effectively, more convincingly, the world and the self, because it has multi-perspective built into it. It's kind of both. You get some language of being, and Du Bois uses it, and even Gilroy will use it, like of being broken or feeling inadequate or feeling like a problem. That's not a positive feeling. But on the other hand, it also gives this radical thing of double or multiple perspective and better consciousness, better sense of modernity, and it can lead, and better theory, let's say. So it has the potential to do both, let's say.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How is hybridity the experience of modernity? Can you explain a little more?
This is the argument that it's not the history of modernity is not domination of whiteness over all other forms of identity. I mean, that you could make that case, but you would miss out how whiteness has been formed by all these identities. Whiteness has been hybridized all along, even though it didn't want to really always agree with that. And certainly these other identities emerged
they had no choice but to hybridize, to absorb some of the European, Western, let's say white sort of systems into their consciousness. But the story of all of modernity, which is ongoing, okay? I don't think we've left modernity exactly, even if we want to periodize and call ourselves postmodern or even after that. But the longer story of modernity has been the mixing of cultures and consciousnesses. And but this is a philosophy of history. Remember earlier today I said, what's your philosophy of history? Well, if your philosophy of history was universalization, or we're going to arrive at the absolute. And Hegel thought we had no choice. We were going to get there anyways. And then, by the way, he said, actually, we already did get there, and we're at the end of history. So we've already achieved all the above, all this true philosophy. The end of philosophy, the end of history, the end of the state, the end of art. Hegel thought we all got that. 1807, folks. We're all just in the aftermath of that. So anyways, I don't think that's true, but the reason why, and maybe the fact that consciousness doesn't actually settle. It's always kind of figuring itself out over and over again, because it is a form of double consciousness or hybrid consciousness. By the way, there's other versions of double consciousness. Like again, Lacan is an example of, he doesn't rationalize it, but you can take it from Freud. Freud, you have the unconscious and the conscious. So even the Freudian model is a form of double consciousness, and is never settled for that very reason. It sounds like a term of deconstruction. It's like a pharmacon in that language we've been using, because it's always like the pharmacon is always sort of criticizing itself and changing itself. And that's part of the power of the pharmacon. It's also part of the difficulty. All right. Now that we've gotten at least a sense of the double consciousness, staying on track here. Gilroy comes out of that and saying that this is the true story of modernity. It's not Hegel. It's not even Lacan. It is this, let's say, double consciousness story of history and modernity. Double consciousness is modernity, not the thing that modernity is supposed to leave behind. He says this at the bottom of 2391. These ideas about ideas about nationality, ethnicity, authenticity, cultural integrity are characteristically modern phenomena that have profound implications for cultural criticism and cultural history. They crystallize with the revolutionary transformations of the West at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th centuries, and involve novel typologies and modes of identification. Any shift towards a postmodern condition should not mean that these modern subjectivities have been left behind, which is an obvious statement, but you could even see back then when Jameson took over. Jameson has nothing to say about black art or even multicultural art. He's just not a good theorist of anything multicultural deep down. He tried to write an essay on what he called third world literatures, and I forget exactly the title of it, but it just kind of failed. Sadly, even though he just died 3 weeks ago, he could have done it 2 months ago. There was time. There were years and years and years, and while he sort of read Fanon a little bit, it's kind of missing. It's a little bit weird. That Sartre goes on and on and on and on, and Jameson goes on and on, and I love Jameson, but it's just a little weird that he never really has one single good reading of any black text as such. I'm trying to think, did I miss one? I just don't think that I can think of one where he really has a profound reading of it. He's so Sartreanized. He's really absorbed that argument from Sartre. It's his favorite theory. Okay, well anyways, Paul Gilroy's saying again, race is a modern question of modernity, not something that we just think is peripheral to modernity. I will point out that there's a kind of interesting debate here that he has within his own method. It comes up a lot actually in this is from this preface or introduction, I think. Let me just read on 2392, the next paragraph in the middle there, he says, regardless of their affiliation to the right or left or center, groups have fallen back on the idea of cultural nationalism on the over-integrated conceptions of culture which present immutable ethnic differences as an absolute break in the histories and experience of black and white people. Against this choice stands another more difficult option, the theorization of creolization, métissage, and hybridity, which he's going to propose, and we're going to see that obviously in Gloria Anzaldúa. From the viewpoint of the ethnic absolutism, this would be a litany of pollution and impurity. These terms are rather unsatisfactory ways of naming the process of cultural mutation and restless discontinuity that exceed racial discourse and avoid capture by its agents. This is. I'm just going to sum this up real quick, but this is a good thing for him. He's actually upset about. Okay, if you are a Derridian, you would be anti-essentialist, and you might say, well, race isn't a thing, and we're anti-essentialists. We don't believe in any certainly biological foundation or any real foundation to identity. Identity is always changing. If you're Deleuzian, you believe it's all about becoming and so on, endlessly becoming. So that would be the anti-essentialist position. But that erases race, clearly. Okay, let's try the opposite. If you're an essentialist, you would say whiteness is this thing, blackness is this thing. These are just different. Okay, but how is that different from older racism, which said whiteness is, biologically superior because it's biologically defined and sort of higher IQ and whatnot, and blackness is biologically lower. So both are problematic. Anti-essentialism tends to not understand race well, and race, and essentialism tends to return to forms of racial hierarchy. So what's left? Is there a third option? And so yes, it would be hybridity, but also Gilroy will call himself an anti-essentialist. And so he's not an anti-essentialist, but he's not essentialist. So he's almost like a doubling of the anti. He's trying to find out a way forward that might include a little bit of both, or kind of avoiding the worst of both at the same time. I just point that out for now. All right, last thing we're going to talk about with Gilroy is the concept of the Black Atlantic, and it's concretized through the ship. So the Black Atlantic is the history of the story of the Atlantic, and the slave trade, the Middle Passage in particular, as central to that story of the Atlantic, what is called the Black Atlantic. He doesn't invent that phrase, but he is essentially the main person who theorizes it. He says on 2393 the following. My search for resources which to comprehend the doubleness and cultural intermixture that distinguishes the experience of Black Britons every Europe required me to seek inspiration from other sources, and in effect to make an intellectual journey across the Atlantic. The Black Americas, so he's going to the United States, Black America's histories of cultural and political debate and organization, I found another second perspective to orient my own position. You can see him using the language of double consciousness over and over again. Double places, Black, U.S. and England, and so on. Here, too, the lure of ethnic particularism and nationalism is provided ever-present danger, but the narrowness of vision with the context. All right, well, I'll just skip a little bit. It's not that important, some of this. All right, so he's sort of trying to traverse the Black Atlantic himself, and then recognizing many have done this before, in both positive and negative ways. Positive, let's say, intellectual ways, but negative in terms of the story of the slave trade. And he says, this chapter proposes some new chronotopes. This is 2394. That might fit with a theory that was less intimated by and respectful of the boundaries and integrity of modern nation states in either English or African American cultural states that have so far been. I have settled on the image of ships in motion across spaces between Europe, America, Africa, and the Caribbean, a central organizing symbol for this enterprise, and as my starting point. The image of the ship, a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, especially important for historical and theoretical reasons that I hope will become clear below. Ships immediately refocus attention on the Middle Passage, on various projects for redemptive return to an African homeland, on the circulation of ideas and activists, as well as the movement of key cultural and political artifacts, tracts, books, gramophone records, choirs, and up to the to the 90s and beyond. Then he tells you a little bit about how the book is organized. He mentions people like Martin Delaney, a writer who proposed a sort of African unity in Oregon, like the 1840s and 50s. I want to just read one more section, skipping a few pages to 2402. So he mentions at the bottom of 2402, this work by these two writers, Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, they ended up doing a very well-known book about the ship. And I'm going to put something on the board in just a second, but I'll just read a few more things. He says, however, it has been estimated at the end of the 18th century, a quarter of the British Navy was composed of Africans for whom the experience of slavery was a powerful orientation to the ideologies of liberty and justice. Looking for similar patterns on the other side of the Atlantic network, we can locate Crispus Attucks, the head of his motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jackdaws. So you know anything about American history, you know that Crispus Attucks was the first person killed in the Revolutionary War. You get that footnote. Or it's just sort of a little bit before the Revolutionary War, but it's one of the sort of harbingers of the Revolutionary War, the Boston Massacre. Denmark Vesey, who is a leader of slave rebellion, foiled slave rebellion, who had sailed the Caribbean and learned of the Haitian Revolution. Skipping a little bit. Then there's Frederick Douglass, whose autobiography revealed that he learned freedom in the North from Irish sailors. So he's in Baltimore, and he sees these sailors working. He learns English. He learns all the sort of savviness, and he makes some money working on the shipyards. He doesn't realize that he doesn't mention that he's working on ships that are going to become slave ships, which is pretty devastating. Fastest ships in the world. Douglass played a neglected role in English anti-slavery activities, escaped from bondage. He disguised himself as a sailor. Then he mentions other people like Marcus Garvey, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, who do transatlantic, they go to France. You would throw in Aimé Césaire. You would throw in Frantz Fanon. They crossed the Atlantic to go to Paris to become intellectuals. So, having said all that, help me theorize the ship. As a theoretical, what he calls it, a chronotope, which means a place and a time, or a site, but we're theorizing a ship. This is another way of, as a synecdoche for Black Atlantic. What is a ship, according to Paul Gilroy? Why is this important? What does it do? How does he theorize it? Get us started.
It moves away from nationalisms.
Okay, good. How? Just say that again.
It moves away from nationalisms by looking at how ideas move between places.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's a between thing. Technically, if you want, way too much theory for today. The oceans are non-state places. Like the ocean is not owned by any state. It's between states, and it figures in very weird ways. So if you want exactly to do what Sarah just said, get away from nationalism, there's one place you can do it. It's on the ocean. Okay, the seas. It's unknown territory. It's extraterritorial. It has a different law. The law of the sea is different from the law of the land. There's a lot of people have theorized this and so on, but this is what Paul Gilroy is picking up. So he's tired of ethno-nationalisms. He's tired of nationalism, to be honest. You might yourself be tired of, certain kinds of nationalism. We're going to see this also in Zaldua. So yeah, the ship is a different kind of space. What else?
I think he also kind of talks about a certain definition of culture,
Yeah.
where he talks about the ship as a moving entity that contains records and stories and sources of music as well.
Paul Gilroy in particular loves music, the history of music, but so if we're talking about musical records, but also stories, it's a place of stories, of cultural mixing. Why? Because sailors come from all over the world, and when you're on that ship, you just never know who's, it's going to go different places, different locations, and it's going to go pick up different peoples and cultures. So it always is, all ships have this kind of cultural mixing space, and it may be negative, it may be the slave trade, so we have to put that up there. Slave trade, Middle Passage. That's a negative form of cultural mixing, but it has led to all sorts of after effects of cultural mixing. Okay.
It could also be inherited identity or inescapable identity. Like Douglas tries to escape slavery, but then he also contributes to it without knowing about it.
Yeah. I'll just say, let's say alternative identity or something like that, or changeable identity or something like that, versus inherited identity. Inherited identity is fixed by maybe nation or biology or race or class, or whatever it is you think fixes your identity. Well, if you don't believe in that or you want to change that, the ship represents that form of escape. Later theorists will use a lot of word, fugitivity. It is a fugitive. It can be. It doesn't always. It's not always, but it can be. Let's say a fugitive machine to carry you to a different place. Very good. Any other ship theory you want to throw out there? Anyone else? From Gilroy or in the bigger picture of it? Anyone else? I'll just, as we're going through here, there's a famous, so he gets this from, the word motley is in that quote there, it's footnote to John Adams. But the phrase motley crew, it doesn't just refer to the band. It comes from pirate ships and ship culture, and it refers again to this cultural mixing that happens on the ship. That you get a whole set of odd characters on the ship. If you're into your Melville and Moby Dick, you see it there. That is a motley crew, literally. People from South Pacific, and there's a whole and there's like a hidden Islamic crew. There is black members of the crew, white members of the crew, all sorts of. There's disabled. Ahab is disabled. Anyways, this hits the nail on the head. This phrase. Anything else about our ship? Anyone want to throw up?
Yeah, I mean, he also talked about the triangle trade more broadly, so like it trades ideas, it facilitates trade.
Yeah. Well, the triangle trade. Yeah, it's not just humans, but so people have written books and theorized things like sugar. People, slaves. Ideas. Tobacco. There's cotton. There's a materiality to this, as well as a philosophy, conceptuality to the ship. The ship itself is a very material object. Okay, it's built by laborers and so on. And where's the wood coming from? Where's the ropes coming from? Where's the crew coming from? But it's also trading ideas, trading law, trading identity. It's trading sugar and so on. It is the thing that defines modernity. The ship is the site of modernity. There's no doubt about it. It has to be theorized. But it's not. This is not called deconstruction now. It's called theorizing the Black Atlantic through ships. And you have to ask, which is actually more powerful? Well, I don't know. I don't want to do the comparative, the more thing. I'll just say they're equally powerful. Deconstruction is as equally as impressive as the Black Atlantic and the ship. And it may be the case that actually there's more to say about this now than even deconstruction at this point. But yeah.
Maybe this is a little bit too out there, but I'm just thinking about how ships are kind of a synecdoche for where they come from.
Yeah.
So you refer to the British Navy when you see a ship that has the British flag.
Yeah.
In the same way that piracy, when you see a pirate ship, it's something that's a larger idea that is boiled down to the instance.
Yeah. So national or Britishness or whatever, but these are all up for debate even today, or American or whatever. Let's say, again, national identity or any version of fixed identity versus a pirate, which is sort of between identities or stealing from, constantly borrowing, or is certainly, a hybrid, but what else would I call a pirate identity? Again, fugitive, outlaw, a certain relationship that is, it's not just hybrid, it's hybrid in a certain way, refusing of the existing law, and it's that kind of normative spread. So the ship can be anti-normative and do all sorts of other kinds of interesting sort of avant-garde positions.
It's like a liminal space.
There we go. Yeah, that can mean between nations or between any of all the above. It can be between all this, or it can just be not exactly between, but its own space. Its own sort of outside of the borders of whatever we think of as whatever those borders are. So, like double consciousness, by the way, it is a place of double consciousness. And that's the same thing. Is it liminal because it's between two things? Or is it liminal because it's actually a third thing, if you will, that is sort of a different kind of experience of consciousness and space and place and time and identity? Yes, it's all the above. Anything else? Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the ship of Theseus, right? Like
Yeah.
everything keeps getting replaced,
Yeah.
and that's like a type of resistance, right? It's always flowing. It's liquid. It's moving.
Yeah, becoming, moving, we have moving over there, changing, rather than a nation which is sort of fixed by land and permanent, in this very different sense of identity. Okay, very well done. I think those are some of the key terms here of what a ship is and how to theorize, and this is exactly what Gilroy is going to offer as this way, as something racial all along, but also he thinks, this by the way is the slightly controversial edge, and he's still alive and he still argues this, that it actually is a critique of critical race theory too. And as I go back and forth with my glasses to see you all, a lot in the black theorist community are not so convinced. That they would prefer a bit more, not like what might we call separatism. Like an example of that would be the Black Panthers. Black Panthers movement in the 1960s was saying we've got to be separate from America. We got to do our own thing, our own society. We are a form of we have to sort of completely separate from white values and so on. And so it's not to say that that's exactly the mentality that it continues, but some argument to the degree that there can still be arguments along those lines. There's one that is in the last reading, and Spekovich. She's quoting Billy Ray Belcourt, so I know you're working on his work, and there's a moment in Billy Ray Belcourt where he says, maybe you're not invited. So that gesture would be a form of separatism. And saying that indigenous identity and, let's say, settler identity do not mix, or do not always mix. Gilroy is very much against that. But other indigenous or black theorists are saying, well, we haven't really understood what blackness is. So before we mix, before we hybridize, let's just understand what blackness is on its own terms. And that is, I totally understand that, or same thing with indigeneity and so on. But Gilroy is kind of still a thorn in a lot of people's sides by saying, I don't agree with that. And the book you wrote after this was called Against Race. So how is it possible? The person who theorized race in this comprehensive way and saying modernity is a problem of race also thought there needs to be a criticism of that tendency. But anyways, you can see it even in here. I don't know, I just highlighted that for now. All right, back to the ship. We did a good job. He has also J.M.W. Turner. Have you seen that famous image painting of the slave ship? Right? Do you know what he's referring to? I'm not going to pull it up on the screen because it's my time, but you know what it's. Anyways, historically, most people didn't even understand that this was a painting of a slave ship. He points that out. But yes, as I think we've covered, it is a pluralized space. I'm just revisiting my notes to see if I missed anything. Yeah. Okay, I think that's good. All right. Last thing. Just before we take a break, I'll just say that sometimes you want to theorize with a theorist. Sometimes you want to theorize a theorist. Sometimes you want to theorize a text. Sometimes you want to theorize a concept. All those are great theory tools. Sometimes you want to theorize an object, a thing, like a ship. A ship can be as theoretically interesting as Sartre or as the mirror stage. Well, mirror stage actually is a thing. As a term like the uncanny. Just keep that in mind. You're developing your theory tools, but I'll just revisit. I've started making a list of things that we've theorized. So the pharmacon, yes, we've done that. The cyborg, it's kind of a thing. Commodity fetish, it's a thing, but it's also a concept. Room of one's own, it's a room. It literally is a room, so it's a thing. We're going to see a little bit in a minute, like things like borderlands or food with bell hooks. People have taken up this model, and for example, theorize like the wake, which is like when you're like a scene of death, but also like watery in the ship's wake. And Christina Sharp is the person who does that. She teaches at York University. So just think about are there things you want to theorize as much as concepts? I think it's a great challenge. Sometimes I brainstorm and I'm like, what are the objects that I might want to theorize as much as the concepts?